Hi, I'm Geoff Nicholson, and this is my story called The Father Figure. It happened again, this time when I was in the Sheffield Botanical Gardens. I was sitting on a bench in front of the grand glass houses. The sun had faded, the day had turned cold, and I was thinking I might get up and take another walk around the bear pit when I saw my father, a man who had been dead for 15 years. Well, of course, I didn't really think it was my father. I didn't believe it was a ghost or a visitation, and neither did I think it was a projection from my own imagination. I didn't know what it was, and I'd got to the point where I didn't expect to find out. In front of me, walking along the path between the herbaceous borders, was a man, clearly a real flesh and blood human being. He was not in any way extraordinary, except that he looked exactly the way my father had in his later years, when he was healthy, before he had the illness that killed him. This man had the same build, the same way of carrying himself, the same slightly faded grey and light brown clothes. He looked fine. He looked very much alive. The only thing that was wrong, the only thing that wasn't like my father, this old guy was walking a dog. My father had never owned a dog, and had never allowed me to have one. Too much trouble, too much responsibility. These days I think he had a point. I was no longer surprised by this kind of sighting, no longer alarmed or frightened, not even all that curious. It had happened too often. The very first time was at my dad's own funeral. My dad and I had never discussed funeral arrangements. We'd rarely talked about anything serious. But I do remember something he said while he was sitting in the brown velour armchair in the living room of the semi-incledeless where my parents lived. He looked up from his crossword and said, "I have my doubts about life after death, but then I'm not even all that convinced about life before death." It was the kind of thing he'd often say, not quite a joke, not quite serious, not exactly profound, but more than just small talk. I smiled and let it go. I hadn't been able to come up with a snappy reply. He died quickly. He had severe back pain, which turned out to be a symptom of renal cancer. But this is not a story about the horrors of cancer. In fact, to be honest, I'm not sure what this story is about. The funeral was at the City Road crematorium. As we turned into the driveway, I looked out of the car window, and standing there by the entrance gate was a man who looked uncannily like my dad. Of course, I thought it was strange, and I didn't know what to make of it, but I had a lot of other things on my mind at that moment. I had a part to play at the funeral, and I didn't want to break character. Back when the business was over, as we stood making awkward conversation, I thought again about Dad's double, and I looked around trying to see him, but there was no sign of him, and I admit I was relieved. By then, I had also started to construct a convincing explanation. Obviously, it wasn't my dad, just somebody who looked like him, maybe a friend from work, and I told myself it wasn't really so surprising. Men of a certain age and type tend to have friends who look much the same way that they do. I didn't for a moment think it was in any sense him, not a spectre or a spirit. It was just one of those bizarre experiences, coincidence, weird stuff that happens. I didn't tell anybody what I'd seen, certainly not my mum. The next sighting came in Weston Park. In a way, that was not so very surprising. My dad died in the Weston Park Hospital, and Weston Park was a place he'd taken me once in a while when I was a kid. I was there about 2 months after he died. It was a sentimental journey, I suppose, but I wasn't trying to make a drama out of it. I just wanted to sit quietly. But drama followed me. And again, I saw a man who looked just like my dad. He was walking down the steps of the Mappin Gallery, moving quickly toward the park gates. If I'd been really determined, I might have been able to catch him up and say something to him, but I didn't try. There seemed no pressing reason. Somehow I already knew that this was going to be one of many sightings. Over the years, there have been maybe 2 sightings a year. That may not seem like many, but over a decade and a half, it adds up. They were all in Sheffield. I never had a sighting when I went away on holiday. I saw him at Meadow Hall, at Midland Station, once in the crowd at Hillsborough, though my dad was never a Wednesday fan, in the Peace Gardens, once in a line in Barker's Pool, once buying wood in B&Q. These events soon ceased to feel especially intense or poignant. They simply became part of my life. One place my dad didn't show up was at my mum's funeral, and something told me he wouldn't. It would have been too obvious, too neat. I never tried to talk to any of these doppelgangers, though in some cases I easily could have. Partly that I didn't want to embarrass myself. Going up to a stranger and saying, "Hey, you look just like my dead dad," is asking for trouble. What are they supposed to do with that bit of information? What can they say in return? There was another reason too, and I know this may sound a bit flaky, but I fear that if I did make contact with any of these sightings, if I spoke to them, if I even took a surreptitious picture with my phone, that would somehow break the spell. That would be the end of things, and I might never see my dad again. I wasn't quite ready for that. Now, in the botanical gardens, the man with the dog approached, got nearer, and then sat down at the far end of the bench I was sitting on, and the dog stretched himself out on the ground between us. This was as close as I'd ever been to one of my father's lookalikes. And I'd expected that when he got really close, I'd find that maybe he didn't look so very much like my dad after all. But no, the resemblance remained convincingly exact. I was close enough to touch him if I'd wanted to, though I can't say I wanted to, and I was definitely close enough to speak. And despite my fears of breaking the spell, I found myself saying, quietly, calmly, "That's a good old dog." The man turned to me unsmiling and said, "Well, he's old anyway." For a while, I thought that was as much as either of us was going to say, but then the old man said, "I know you, don't I?" And if you want to know what happens next, you'll have to read the rest of the story in the Book of Sheffield, published by the Comma Press. Thank you very much.